Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the Conservative Party in A-level politics. So that's not just all the knowledge you need to know and some key specific examples, but also key points of analysis and the key questions you could get asked in the exam, as well as how you could potentially structure them. So I'm going to start by going through the origins and historical development of the Conservative Party. So that's looking at from traditional conservatism to one nation conservatism to Thatcherism, and Thatcher and the New Right, and then also going up to the present day. So a lot of the recent prime ministers and Conservative Party leaders. From there, I'm going to look at Conservative Party policy. So that's the policies and ideas of the Conservative Party under Thatcher, under Cameron, and under Sunak currently, looking at economic policy, law and order policy, welfare policy, and foreign policy. And then at the end, I'm going to circle back to the potential questions you could get asked in the exam and kind of give some advice and look at how you could potentially structure your answers and what information you could include. So the PDF you should be seeing up there, you can find on the Politics Explained website in the first link in the description, where you can also find lots of resources to help you in your politics A-level, including essay plans, these all you need to know guides, as well as a place to sign up for tutoring and some group classes if that's something you'd be interested in. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the kind of potential questions and key debates you could get asked about. So this lesson covers the Conservative Party, established political parties. So it's in established political parties and it's the Conservative Party. So the origin and historical development of the party, how this has shaped their ideas and current policies on the economy, law and order, welfare and foreign affairs. In terms of the key debates you could get asked, they're in relation to current Conservative Party policy and kind of the current Conservative Party and how close it is to Thatcherism or one nation policy, as well as how close it is to the policies of other parties, especially the Labour Party. You should be able to make 3 essay plans on this, one of which also covers the Labour Party topic, which you can then adapt to different, more specific questions that will come up. So I'd make these 3. Evaluate the view that the Conservative Party has abandoned Thatcherism. Evaluate the view that the Conservative Party can be described as a one-nation party. And finally, evaluate the view that the policies of the Labour and Conservative parties are more similar than they are dissimilar. So yeah, at the end of the video, I'll go back to those and kind of after the content, talk about how you could use the content to answer those and potentially structure them. There'll also be essay plans for those on the Politics Explained website very soon, so make sure to sign up to the Politics Explained newsletter so you know as soon as they come out. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into the origins and historical development of the Conservative Party. So, starting off with the kind of how the Conservative Party originated, and that's with traditional conservatives. So the party originated in the late 17th century Tory party, which was an aristocratic group in Parliament that came together in defence of the historic privileges of the Crown, the Church, and powerful land-owning institutions, especially in relation and against the kind of French Revolution, which was kind of really threatening those key institutions in France. By the 1830s, under Sir Robert Peel, it was evolving into a party that was kind of really dedicated to the defence of property, traditional institutions, traditional authority, and against the threat of revolution and socialism. Peel stressed the importance of gradual reform in order to protect and conserve established institutions, hence kind of the name Conservative. By appealing to both the middle classes and the aristocracy, the Conservatives were able to broaden their support and were very successful in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And especially into the early 20th centuries, they also got a significant number of working class supporters. So that's traditional conservatives and the origins of the party. What you then have is a bit of a move to one nation conservatives. So it developed into one nation conservatism, originally associated with party leader and Prime Minister Disraeli in the late 19th century. And one nation conservatism sought to bridge the gulf between the classes through a paternalistic social policy in which the natural leaders would act benevolently towards the disadvantaged in return for acceptance of their right to rule. So that was especially in relation to trying to gain working class supporters and broaden their base away from just the kind of upper middle class and the ruling classes. And yeah, as I said, they did that through effectively reaching out a bit more of a paternalistic social policy, and also emphasizing the nation, the United Kingdom, in order to suggest that everyone within the nation had more in common than they had which divided them. Obviously, socialism at the time was trying to suggest that within the nation there was more that divided people, especially between workers and the owners and kind of the rulers in society. So Disraeli and other leaders sought to win support through social reform and a patriotic foreign policy, with the aim of strengthening national unity. The key point where this ideology peaked was in the post-war consensus. So that's in the years after World War II, when the party broadly accepted the changes introduced by the 1945 to 51 Attlee government. So that's the welfare state, the NHS, kind of lots of government intervention to maintain high employment and kind of Keynesian economics. And they balanced free enterprise with state intervention in economic and social policy. So really accepting a lot of the policies that the Labour Party, under kind of old Labour, had introduced. They prided themselves on a pragmatic, non-ideological approach, and maintained the party contest between themselves and the Labour Party, but undid few of their policies when they took office. And as I said, this period was known as the post-war consensus. What you then have is Thatcher and the New Right coming in the mid-1970s, and really in the 1970s and 1980s, when Thatcher was in power, really changing the Conservative Party and changing British politics and massively reducing the size of the state. So Thatcher really moved away from this one nation conservatism and gave her name to a far more ideological form of conservatism, Thatcherism, which was linked intellectually to the rise of the New Right. It sought to reduce state intervention in the economy whilst restoring order to society in the face of militant trade unions and other groups on the left. So that kind of crusade against the unions was a really key part of Thatcher's policy, as we'll see later on in the video. In the UK, this kind of New Right approach can be seen as slightly limited, though, especially in comparison to the US, due to the popularity of the NHS as kind of state-funded healthcare. But obviously, Thatcher did still make a lot of economic changes and was able to massively change the level of state intervention in the UK and massively reduce it. So Thatcher embodied strong conviction politics, and her radical policy agenda rejected the instinct of one nation conservatives to seek compromise. And as a result, she was an extremely, and continues to be, an extremely divisive figure in UK politics. In terms of introducing her policies and winning elections, she was very successful, winning 3 elections and massively changing government policy in a range of areas. And then just looking in a little bit more detail at the key themes of Thatcherism, the first one is neoliberal economics. So that's limited public spending, tax cuts for businesses and the rich in order to try and stimulate economic growth, mass privatisation of previously state-held industries, so a real belief in privatisation and opposition to nationalisation. And so state-held industries and services to promote improvement, innovation, and consumer choice through competition. So there's a real belief in the free market and in capitalism. It was in legally limiting the power of trade unions to deter strikes and really opposing the disruptive influence that Thatcher saw the trade unions as having in the UK economy. A very tough approach to law and order, and a very strong, assertive approach to foreign policy, including against the Soviet Union and kind of seeking to project and protect Britain's interests abroad, including through a special relationship with the US. So this led to the nickname the Iron Lady in terms of her foreign policy, because she was seen as having a very strong foreign policy, particularly in relation to the Soviet Union. And it also included Euroscepticism and seeking to protect the sovereignty of Britain against the EU. So Thatcher didn't support leaving the EU, she certainly didn't, but she was very much concerned by the increasing kind of political project of the EU and the idea of the euro as well, which other parts of her party, including John Major, who followed her, were a lot more supportive of. So yeah, we'll look at the Thatcher's specific policies a bit later in the video, but that's kind of just an introduction to Thatcher and Thatcherism. So then, after Thatcher and leading up to Cameron, you had a number of Conservative Party leaders who were relatively unsuccessful. So John Major was successful in winning the 1992 election. So he played quite an important role in getting rid of Thatcher in 1990. Won the 1992 election, but then lost in 1997 against Blair's landslide. So in a way, John Major represented a continuation of Thatcherism, with kind of continuing to privatise coal and the railways, but he was less of a confrontational figure. So Thatcher at that point had become very, very divisive, especially with the poll tax, and John Major sought to move away from that a little bit. As I said, he narrowly won the 1992 general election, but his premiership became troubled by divisions over Europe within the Conservative Party, which, along with a series of scandals sleaze scandals especially, and a growing sense of exhaustion on the part of the government led to a huge defeat to Tony Blair in 1997. Major was a moderate pro-European who unsuccessfully tried to reconcile two opposing factions. That was hardline Eurosceptics, who wanted stronger resistance against the encroaching power of the EU, which Thatcher would kind of be more in that camp, and a smaller group of pro-Europeans who wanted Britain to remain influential over a rapidly integrating continent, and remain having a real key vote share and a key level of power within the EU. So that was major, largely continued Thatcherism, but it's often described as kind of Thatcherism with a human face. But then obviously got defeated in 1997. Then during the Blair years, you had a number of leaders who were unsuccessful in beating the New Labour Party. So William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith, and Michael Howard all failed to unseat Tony Blair, who successfully held the middle ground and continued to win a lot of middle-class voters, and won two subsequent elections after 1997 in 2001 and 2005. Crucially, all three leaders failed to distance themselves from Thatcherism, which has become quite toxic, and failed to move the party beyond an association with Europe, immigration, and law and order. The party's ageing membership and outdated policies failed to appeal to an increasingly diverse society as well. So that some of the key reasons why they were unsuccessful in the first decade of the 21st century. Then you have Cameron, who was able to detoxify the Conservative Party and win a lot more votes again. So Cameron's election as party leader in December 2005 brought the fresh thinking of a new generation to the party. So he was very young when he was chosen to be party leader. So it was respectful of Thatcher, but aware that Britain had considerably changed and aware of the need to move away from Thatcherism a bit, especially in terms of the image of the party. So Cameron learned from the way that Blair had reinvented the Labour Party with New Labour to win support beyond its traditional core vote, and identified himself as a liberal conservative who was tolerant of minority groups and different lifestyles. He also showed an interest in the environment, which was gaining more and more importance, and demonstrated the value he placed on public services such as the NHS, and kind of sought to kind of use the phrase of the big society to bring back a bit of one nation conservatism. His premiership was ultimately defined by austerity, though, which can be seen as quite opposed to one nation conservatism and quite a Thatcherite policy, as I'll note later in the video. So these were spending cuts to reduce government deficits following the 2008 financial crash, and it was also defined by divisions over Europe, which, yeah, as I said, can be seen as going against this one nation shift. And it was these divisions over Europe in the 2016 Brexit referendum that ultimately brought Cameron down. So both Cameron and May, who followed Cameron, maintained they stood on the side of ordinary people rather than just the elite, and tried to move the party away from this image as the nasty party, which Thatcher kind of gained for the party. Whilst Thatcher presented the Conservatives of the party for individualism and self-determination, Cameron emphasised the bonds between people, arguing for cooperation between the state and charities and the voluntary sector, including building a big society, which, as I said, in many ways seems like an updating of one nation conservatism. Thatcher's morally authoritarian tone was replaced, for example, by support for the legalisation of gay marriage, and that's especially in comparison to Thatcher's Section 28 of the Local Government Act, which banned the promotion of homosexuality and was a very homophobic policy. So, following Cameron, what you have now is, in the last 6 or 7 years, 4 Conservative Party leaders. So Theresa May sought to continue Cameron's kind of liberal and one nation approach combined with continued austerity, but ultimately it's hard to see an ideological vision because A, she wasn't there for that long, and B, her premiership became largely defined by Brexit. So she sought to invoke strong and stable leadership at the start of her premiership and in the 2017 election, but turned out to be kind of completely the opposite, following losing the majority of the Conservatives in the 2017 election, and then ultimately being ousted in 2019 by the kind of hard Brexit wing of the party, which Boris Johnson led, and Boris Johnson ultimately replaced her. Boris Johnson also, his premiership, kind of, it's difficult to find an ideological position as well, because it too was defined by events. Specifically for Johnson, that was COVID. So in the 2019 election, he was able to, or after the 2019 election, he was able to kind of pass his Brexit deal. So that can be seen like he was very much a Brexiteer, and that was key to his party's policy, using the slogan "Get Brexit Done." But as I said, his premiership quickly became defined by COVID and its aftermath, especially the Partygate scandal. So his government and policy was largely driven by events rather than ideological position, but he did move the party away from austerity in the 2019 election, which obviously then very much continued following COVID, with the huge spending on the furlough scheme, which was debt funded. Though, of course, that can be seen as kind of partly a move away from austerity, because there was that move in 2019 prior to COVID as well, but also that can be seen very much in terms of the specific context. And he also sought to promote a levelling up agenda, to invest in the north especially. And yeah, as I said, that kind of significant debt-based spending can be seen as a significant departure from Thatcherism and from austerity as well. So then, following Boris Johnson resigning, or kind of effectively being deposed by his cabinet after the Partygate scandal, you had Liz Truss, who was ultimately there for only 45 days. But she did have a strong ideological position. Ultimately, she was brought down because, or she was forced to resign because of the failure of her plan and her attempts to reintroduce Thatcherism. So in the context of the cost of living crisis, she thought Truss sought to reintroduce Thatcherism to try and boost the UK's economy, but failed miserably. So her and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng introduced a mini budget in which Truss announced they'd be cutting taxes significantly, including corporation tax, abolishing the top rate of income tax, and cutting stamp duty. And all of these were to be funded by borrowing. So that can very much be seen as quite Thatcherite policy. The mini budget ended up being disastrous, though, resulting in a rapid fall in the value of the pound, and the Bank of England responding by increasing interest rates. She tried to kind of, in a last gasp attempt, to reverse some of her policies and replace Kwarteng with Jeremy Hunt, but it was ultimately too late, and she was forced to resign. And then she was replaced by Rishi Sunak, who is the current Prime Minister, and had been her main opposition in the 2022 Conservative Party leadership election. So Sunak is a Brexiteer and was Chancellor under Boris Johnson, and reversed kind of a key part of what Sunak did was to come in and reverse Truss's kind of Thatcherite reforms, which obviously hadn't really had much time to come into play or take effect because she'd only been there for 45 days. His policy platform isn't yet entirely clear, as when I'm recording this video, he really hasn't been in power for that long. But he has set out 5 priorities for 2023, which you should be seeing up there, including halving inflation, growing the economy, the debt falling, cutting the NHS waiting lists, and passing new laws to stop small votes. So the first 3 of those are effectively just seeking to stabilise the economy and improve the economy in the context of the cost of living crisis and in response to the effects of Truss's attempted Thatcherite reforms. And in terms of the others, cutting NHS waiting lists can be seen more as in response to government outrage, though he hasn't actually done much in terms of real attempts in funding the NHS to do so. But then in the 5th one, you do see a key part of his ideology. That's a very strong stance against immigration. So later in the video, in the last part, we'll see Sunak's policies. I'm going to start by looking at the policies of the Conservative Party under Thatcher. Okay, so we've somewhat covered this already, but in terms of Thatcher's policy, starting off with economic policy, she greatly reduced taxes and public spending in an attempt to encourage individualism and economic growth. So the top rate of income tax was reduced from 83% when she came to power to 40% in her last budget. So it's a massive cut in tax. Corporation tax was reduced from 52% down to 34%. In her first 2 years, spending was cut by £1 billion, including cuts in housing, energy, education, employment, industrial subsidies, transport, and foreign aid. Ultimately, though, and we'll note this in the kind of foreign and law and order policy, she didn't reduce funding for the police and the armed forces, but apart from that, had a big regime of austerity and cutting budgets. And also, so kind of cutting taxes, cutting public spending, 2 key parts of her economic policy. The third part was privatisation, which you can really note in your essays. And she supported privatisation and the removing of the state from the market. So very much believed in free market economics. and introduced a series of huge privatisations that started in 1981 with British Telecom. Her government also introduced the right to buy scheme to allow people to purchase and own their own capital houses. So, in terms of those three key policies I said, privatisation, reducing taxes, reducing public spending. In terms of law and order policy, she had a very strong law and order policy. So she took on the unions, calling them the enemy within, and successfully reduced their powers by making striking more difficult and using the police against striking workers, often violently. Despite cutting the budgets of other departments, as I said, she increased funding for the police and armed forces, showing a very strong law and order policy, especially in relation to the police, and was generally very tough on crime. So overall, quite a strong approach to law and order. In terms of welfare policy, with the 1988 Great Education Reform Act, Thatcher removed the control over education from local politicians, making schools self-governing and the curriculum decided by the UK government rather than locally by local politicians. Thatcher, kind of going into her economic policy as well, linking with her economic policies, cut the budgets of many departments and reduced some benefits, but didn't privatise the NHS due to the strong public support for it. So in terms of welfare policy, it can really be seen in the context of cutting budgets. In terms of foreign policy, as mentioned earlier in the video, she had a very strong, assertive foreign policy that led to her gaining the reputation as the Iron Lady. So she strongly projected Britain's interests abroad, including against the USSR and in the Falklands War, and developed a strong relationship with Reagan in the US. That special relationship with the US was very important to Thatcher's policy. She was also Eurosceptic and sought to project Britain's sovereignty against a growing EU, but she did support the economic community of the EU and the liberalisation of the EU. So saw the EU as kind of economically very beneficial in terms of facilitating trade, however, didn't like the increasing political project that the EU represented. She also refused to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa and described Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. So a lot of flaws in her foreign policy. And then finally, looking at some other policies, as kind of I mentioned earlier in the video, Section 28 of the Local Government Act of 1988 introduced a ban on promoting homosexuality in schools, which is extremely homophobic and has been strongly condemned. And this kind of showed how she saw herself as supporting Christian values at the time. Near the end of her premiership, Thatcher caused great controversy by introducing the poll tax to replace council tax, which would mean that all individuals paid the same amount of kind of council tax, rather than it being based on the value of one's property. So this caused massive outrage. There were poll tax riots, and was kind of a key factor in her ultimately being brought down by her cabinet. So overall, Thatcher had a massive impact on the policy of the Conservative Party and the politics of the UK, and really shifted the Conservative Party away from one nation conservatism. So yeah, as I said, rejected one nation conservative ideas of compromise, instead being a conviction politician, and successfully implemented her new right agenda. And she continues to be a very divisive figure in UK politics. So moving on to the policies of the Conservative Party under Cameron. In terms of economic policy, it can be seen as quite similar to Thatcherism. So Cameron's main priority was to reduce the budget the budget deficit he inherited from Labour, and introduce austerity to maintain the confidence of the financial markets and prevent Britain's borrowing costs from rising. So this regime of austerity was pretty harsh. So the budgets of government departments were cut by up to 25%. And he said this was necessary and blamed the 2008 financial crash and the problems that came after it for the UK economy on Labour's irresponsible overspending. He didn't increase taxes to raise more money though. So there again, so cutting spending, and again you can see continued support for low taxes. So it didn't increase taxes to raise more money, instead actually cutting them in 2015. And then similar to Thatcher as well, very much supported continued support privatisation. In terms of law and order policy, that's where you see a bit of a move away from Thatcher. So Cameron seemed to take a more liberal attitude towards law and order, calling for more understanding of young offenders in particular, and took a balanced approach that promoted a rehabilitation revolution to reduce the problem of reoffenders. However, he still did support tough sentencing for certain crimes, especially following the 2011 London riots. So in a way, that can be seen as quite similar to New Labour's policy of tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. In terms of welfare policy, the policies of the coalition were very much should be seen in the context of austerity. and were intended to cut costs and encourage those receiving benefits to be more self-reliant. So he distinguished between hard-working strivers and undeserving shirkers, who the government sought to penalise. So there was a real kind of penalisation and a lot of negative rhetoric against those on benefits when Cameron was in power, which a lot of people would see as unfair. The universal credit system of benefits was also introduced and intended to simplify the welfare system and encourage low-income people to take up employment. The coalition also implemented a radical overhaul of the NHS and allowed the private sector to compete with state hospitals. So that's therefore showing a continued belief in privatisation with Thatcher. In terms of foreign policy, Cameron's approach is similar to Thatcher's in that he promoted the special relationship with the US, supported airstrikes against IS in Syria and Iraq, and supported pragmatic Euroscepticism. He ultimately tried to fight Britain's corner in the EU, attempting to renegotiate the UK's terms of membership before holding a referendum in which he supported Remain, but ultimately had to resign when he lost it. In terms of other policy, Cameron kind of really prioritised tackling climate change, saying his government would be the greenest government ever, and prioritised green investments and introducing a carbon tax on fossil fuels. Partly influenced by being in power with the Lib Dems in the coalition, Cameron also sought to be a liberal conservative and importantly legalised same-sex marriage in 2013. So overall, there was this attempt to move back to one nation conservatism and to seek to liberalise the party somewhat, and he did in some important ways, especially in kind of law and order policy, the rehabilitation revolution, which he talked about, and the legalisation of same-sex marriage. In other ways, he was still very reminiscent of Thatcher, though, especially in terms of austerity and economic policy, and in having a very strong foreign policy which emphasised a special relationship with the US. Okay, so finally, I'm going to look at the current policies of the Conservative Party under Rishi Sunak. So as I said, you need to be updating your notes on this, and I'll be updating the notes on this PDF on the Politics Explained website, as we'll learn a lot more as Rishi Sunak has a lot more time in power. But this is kind of what we've got currently. So in terms of economic policy, Sunak's economic policy is focused on trying to prioritise national finances in the context of the cost of living crisis by reducing the national debt and seeking to halve inflation by the end of 2023. So a real emphasis placed on responsible national finances and effectively trying to reverse the damage of Liz Truss's Thatcherite tax cuts. His government seems likely to do so by increasing taxes and cutting public spending. So corporation tax, for example, will rise from 19% to 25% in April 2023, compared to Liz Truss, who sought to cut it. Sunak will also increase the national living wage from £9.50 an hour to around £10.40 an hour in response to rising inflation. So yeah, kind of seemed a bit of a move away from Liz Truss's kind of quite radical Thatcherite reforms and prioritising national finances, though that could also include cutting public spending, which would seem similar to David Cameron's austerity, but is yet to be seen the exact picture of the Conservative Party's current economic policies. In terms of other economic policy, you could include this in kind of a law and order paragraph or in the economic policy paragraph. His government is strongly opposing striking workers, refusing to offer them substantial real-term pay increases in the context of falling real-term wages due to rising inflation, and is also looking to introduce anti-strike legislation. So that brings us on to law and order policy, and Sunak's government seems to be taking a tough approach to crime, pledging to recruit 20,000 additional police officers and reduce homicide, serious violence and neighbourhood crime by 20%. Sunak is also taking a very tough approach to striking workers and protests. As I said, looks likely to introduce anti-strike legislation and laws to limit protests in the UK, which can be seen as a very kind of tough approach to law and order, and one that in many ways does threaten rights. So you can kind of go to the Rights in Context video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel to see a bit more on that. Sunak is also taking a very strong stance against immigration, pledging to stop small boats and quickly deport those who arrive illegally in the UK by preventing those without valid documents from claiming asylum. He's also pushing ahead with the policy to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda, as well as moving forward or moving towards an Australian-style points-based immigration system in the future, which would limit who is able to enter the country illegally. So a very kind of anti-immigration policy, really trying to limit immigration, which can be seen as quite a kind of key policy of kind of Boris Johnson's government as well, and kind of the Brexit campaign, which Sunak is very much continuing. In terms of welfare policy, Sunak has promised to cut NHS waiting times, but has so far failed to deliver a substantial increase in funding to the NHS, with the kind of £300 million funding or emergency funding promised kind of being very little compared to the £7 billion of funding that NHS is asking for. Sunak has also opposed striking NHS nurses, ambulance workers, and teachers, and is seeking to introduce mandatory minimum service levels as part of his new proposed anti-strike legislation. And in terms of the welfare policy as well, Sunak, as Starmer does, continues to support the role of the private sector in the NHS. In terms of foreign policy, Starmer's government appears to have a strong, assertive foreign policy. So much like Starmer and Johnson, Sunak has strongly supported Ukraine in the war against Russia and provided substantial sums of money and arms. Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has also detailed this tough stance the UK needs to take on China and its lack of adherence to the rules and norms of the international community, which can potentially be seen as similar to Thatcher's strong stance against the USSR. And Sunak's government also continues to strongly support Brexit and take a strong stance in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. In terms of other policy, there are others, but Sunak has reintroduced the ban on fracking that Liz Truss briefly lifted when in power. So overall, Sunak's policies have certainly moved away from Truss's strong Thatcherite approach and seem instead to be prioritising national finances. But his strong approach to law and order, immigration, foreign policy, and striking workers seems similar to that of Boris Johnson's premiership and similar to Thatcher in a lot of ways as well. So yeah, that's all the content. What I'm now going to do is quickly go into some of the possible questions you could get asked and how you could potentially structure them. So, as I've kind of been referencing throughout the video, one of the key questions you could get asked is in terms of how close the current Conservative Party is to Thatcherism. So something like evaluate the view that the Conservative Party has abandoned Thatcherism. In terms of structuring that paragraph, you could do, it would be good to kind of structure it in terms of types of policy. So always start with economic policy. It's the most important and you really need to cover it. So you could do a paragraph on economic policy, how close the current party is to Thatcherism. And in that, in the kind of close to Thatcherism, you could include like the Liz Truss sought to move the party back to Thatcherism. You can also include the kind of party's continued support for privatisation. And you could also include the idea that kind of the current government may cut some taxes and especially cut public spending in order to prioritise national finances. In terms of against arguments for that, you've got the kind of Sunak's policies moving away from Liz Truss's approach and Liz Truss's attempt to move back to Thatcherism in terms of cutting taxes, as actually the current Conservative Party may increase some taxes. Then you could potentially do two other paragraphs, right? So foreign policy, where you could probably largely demonstrate how the party's current policy is similar to that of Thatcher, though potentially slightly different in terms of it's kind of even more strongly Eurosceptic than Thatcher was. And then potentially in terms of law and order policy, you could cover kind of strong approach to the strong stance on the unions, a tough approach to crime and law and order, and then also maybe even moving away a little bit in terms of immigration. So the current party has a very strong stance on immigration compared to Thatcher, who was a bit more supportive of immigration due to its potential economic benefits. In terms of this second question, evaluate the view that the Conservative Party can be described as a one-nation party. You probably want to have kind of a very similar kind of structure of paragraphs in terms of economic policy, law and order policy, foreign policy, potentially. And in that, it would almost often be the flip side, because kind of Thatcherism is often, or kind of is in many ways, the kind of flip side of one nation conservatism. So you'd be looking at similar points, but if its current party is kind of, you see the current party as being quite Thatcherite, that's likely to be not very one nation. So consider those points as well. And the final thing it would be, or the final question it would be good to practice is in relation to the Labour Party as well. So evaluate the view that the policies of the Labour and Conservative parties are more similar than they are dissimilar. In that one, I'd have a very similar structure of paragraph. So you'd have first one on economic policy, second one on kind of law and order policy and the unions, and a third one on foreign policy. You can also, and in all of these, you'll be including some of the welfare policy in the kind of economic policy and law and order policy paragraphs. So in terms of economic policy, there's some ways in which they're similar, right? Broadly committed to national to privatisation, not really either looking to increase taxes massively or change taxes massively. In terms of differences, Starmer is looking to increase taxes somewhat, especially for high earners, as you'll see in the Labour Party video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel, as well as kind of having a lot more supportive approach to striking workers, whereas the Conservative Party is a lot more kind of a lot more opposed, has a lot more negative view, and is seeking to introduce anti-strike legislation in relation to the union. In terms of law and order policy, both can be seen as probably quite similar at the moment in terms of similar to a kind of tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime approach. Both have pledged to significantly increase the number of police officers. And then you could look at those differences in the unions in that paragraph instead, if you'd like, and then potentially look at some differences in relation to immigration. And then foreign policy paragraph, it'd largely be seen as quite similar. I'd imagine in terms of, especially in terms of support for Ukraine, strong defence policy, support for Western intervention, and special relationship with the US, but probably quite a key difference in terms of their level of support for Brexit. So obviously both parties now do support Brexit and aren't seeking to reverse it, but the Conservative Party continues to have a very strong stance in relation to Brexit. So if you want to look at those in more detail, there'll soon be plans, kind of detailed essay plans for those on the Politics Explained website, as well as detailed essay plans for kind of everything else for UK politics, which you can purchase on the Politics Explained website. Make sure to sign up to the newsletter so you find out as soon as those are released, so that you can kind of be really well prepared for the exam this year. And yeah, look at the Politics Explained website for lots of other resources as well. Feel free to drop any questions or comments in the comment section below if there's anything I can help with. And go to the Politics Explained website as well if you're interested in signing up for any tutoring or group classes, which I'm going to be running over Easter. So yeah, that's pretty much everything. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.